Common sense. You've certainly heard about it and probably rely on it in many circumstances. And yet, I've gradually come to the conclusion that, while not useless, common sense is a pretty bad tool to use in many different cases, and its powers and benefits have been greatly overplayed and exaggerated. In short, maybe we shouldn't rely on common sense nearly as much as we do. But before we get too far into that, let's back up just a little bit. This is Thoughtful Beetle, and here we discuss topics that deserve additional deep thought. This is the second part of a 4-part toolkit on critical thinking, based on the practices and ideas that have helped me navigate a world full of varied information and opinions. If you want to take a look at the first part of the toolkit, how to identify a good source, check out the link in the description below. But going back to common sense is a term we see used very frequently. We often hear about things like common sense gun reform, or how those we disagree with are lacking in common sense. You could even argue that the founding of our country is based on common sense, that being the title of Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet describing how America should become independent from Great Britain. In all of these cases, common sense is viewed as highly beneficial, pretty obvious, and very useful for drawing good conclusions. So, common sense appears to be a good thing, but what is common sense? The term is used a lot, but the actual definition is a bit harder to pin down. As Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once said of pornography, "I know it when I see it." Well, that often seems to be how people view common sense. It's a bit hard to define, but they know it when they see it. With all that in mind, there's a few commonalities I've seen with how people use the term common sense. Common sense seems to be something you expect most people to agree on, it's something that can be applied quickly, and it's something that is generally considered to be practical. So with all that in mind, I would define common sense as a way of quickly making decisions, often based on current and widely held ethical and practical generalities. In other words, common sense is the general accepted thing to do, based on societal knowledge of the time. And common sense can indeed be very useful. Common sense might tell us to avoid taking candy from strangers, or to not stick a metal fork into a toaster. Common sense lets us know how we should act and react in many social situations, when to tell a white lie or when to back down from an argument. It gives us a guide of how to act in everyday situations where you think, this is just the thing to do. But what do we do if someone says to us, of course the Earth is flat, it's just common sense. If the Earth was round, we would all fall off the planet unless we happen to be at the North Pole. Now clearly we know this person is wrong, but are they not using common sense when they say that the Earth is flat? Clearly at one point in the past it was common sense that the Earth was flat, but is that no longer the case? And why not? And worst of all, the argument that the Earth is flat makes sense. We intuitively agree that if the Earth was round, we should fall off if we were on the underside of the planet. All is to say that despite its many uses, there are some very deep and serious flaws with common sense. Broadly, there are 3 core issues. There aren't universal criteria for what is and is not common sense. Common sense is often an argument from tradition. And finally, common sense is based on things that make sense, but are not necessarily supported by evidence. The unifying theme behind these points is that calling something common sense allows people to accept it as being true without actually providing a good reason to believe that it is true. There's a lot to go into with these, but let's start with the first point. The lack of universal criteria for common sense. This may seem a bit confusing, considering I just gave a definition of common sense a minute ago, but you'll notice in that definition, and in the ways that I've seen common sense applied, that common sense is dependent on the knowledge and beliefs of the society or group that you're in. Different societies and groups will have different widely held practical and ethical knowledge, and therefore common sense will differ between different groups. Some things may stay the same, but a lot of things will be different. In our previous example, common sense might tell someone who traveled widely that the Earth must be flat because they never encountered a point in their travels where the Earth began to curve. But to someone who has circumnavigated the globe, common sense would tell them that the Earth must be round, otherwise they never would have returned to the same spot. Both people used common sense, but reached contradictory conclusions because their common sense was based on different knowledge. As a more contemporary and complicated example, many people would consider it common sense to trust the police, considering they're the ones society has hired and paid to protect us. But other people would consider it common sense not to trust the police, and see many examples of discriminatory, violent, or unlawful behavior inside of police forces. This becomes very problematic because it means multiple people can use common sense and arrive at very different conclusions. there's no innate consistency, or importantly, a way to tell someone that they use common sense correctly or incorrectly. This variability in outcomes using the same process means that common sense is inherently unreliable as a means to determine truth. As a counterpoint, let's look at activities that are illegal. Now, while there's some legally gray areas, by reading the law, we can usually definitively say this action is legal or that action is illegal. We have a universally accepted standard that we can use to come to a consensus if we happen to disagree about the illegality of an action. Common sense, on the other hand, has no universal standard, and therefore we can't come to a consensus if we disagree about what is and is not common sense. Because of this, if somebody says, "I'm right because it's common sense," it really isn't that different than them saying, "I'm right because I'm right." My second objection to common sense is well summarized in a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. Common sense is nothing more than a deposit of prejudices laid down in your mind before you reach 18. This idea that common sense is composed of a bunch of prejudices speaks to the fact that common sense is largely an appeal to tradition. An appeal to tradition is the idea that something is true or good because it has been done in the past. While rarely phrased so bluntly as this, common sense often relies heavily on folk wisdom and tradition, especially common sense related to what is morally right or wrong. Long-standing cultural views and knowledge are frequently incorporated into common sense and taken to be true without ever looking critically at whether they are in fact true or not. This can allow prejudices and simply false information to persist in groups just because it's commonly held to be true. The view that the Earth was flat persisted for such a long time not because it was actually true, but largely because it was widely accepted to be true without being critically examined. There are many examples of this, where damaging or incorrect cultural views persist as truth. Baseless superstition, stigmatization of those who are different, the superiority of one group over another. By lumping these together as part of common sense, these ideas can persist as obvious and unquestioned truths about the world, without ever needing to seriously be defended or justified. Because of this, it makes it much harder to confront these views and eventually to remove them. Finally, there's the issue of common sense equating making sense to being true. I see this most frequently when common sense is used to determine the particular outcome of an event, or to predict what's going to happen in the future. Someone might say that, of course, it's just common sense that having the death penalty would reduce the number of murders that take place. And I could see why they would say that, because it makes a lot of sense that having the death penalty as a deterrent for criminals would reduce the number of murders that occur. But here's the problem. Just because something makes sense does not mean that it's true. Here's another way to look at it, this time approached from a philosophical standpoint. Let's say I make a series of premises, and then a conclusion based on them. My premises are 1. The death penalty is a strong punishment. 2. Strong punishments lead to fewer people committing murder. And my conclusion is 3. Having the death penalty as a punishment will lead to fewer people committing murder. This argument makes sense. And if the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true as well. An argument like this is also known as being valid. But on the other hand, if the premises turn out to not be true, then we can't say the conclusion is true. So we also need to check and see if the argument is sound. That is, the argument is both valid, it makes sense, and the premises are actually true. If we look at the evidence and find out that the strength of a punishment does not have an effect on how likely people are to commit murder, then we have shown premise 2 to be false. And if premise 2 is false, then our conclusion is unsupported, and we have no basis to say it is true, regardless of whether the argument makes sense or not. The argument is valid, but it isn't sound, and ultimately, we can't say it's true. Okay, so how does all this relate to common sense? Well, common sense solutions oftentimes are examples of arguments that are valid but aren't sound. Frequently, when I hear hypothetical solutions that are labeled as common sense, what the person is actually saying is, this makes sense, therefore I don't need any evidence to back it up. This is a problem because it means that lots of things can then be declared true without having the proper evidence to back them up. And lots of things can make sense but not be remotely true. Saying the Earth is flat, otherwise we'd fall off, makes sense, but is not true. It turns out that when we examine the evidence, we find that gravity pulls us towards the planet, and that determines what down is. So in this case, it turns out that we can live on a round planet, and it feels like it's flat. what intuitively makes sense to us on one scale does not necessarily hold true on another scale. Okay, so common sense has some issues. But what am I actually advocating here? I'm not advocating that we do away with common sense. As previously stated, common sense can be extremely useful in certain circumstances. Arguments that are valid often do turn out to be sound, and long-held practical and cultural beliefs about what's right and wrong oftentimes can lead us to more compassionate and inclusive worldviews. A good example of this comes from the Pew Research Center, who in 2014 questioned thousands of Americans about their views on if homosexuality should be accepted or if it should be discouraged. Amongst all respondents, 62% said it should be accepted, and 31% said it should be discouraged. However, among those who said common sense was their primary source of guidance on what is right and what's wrong, 72% said homosexuality should be accepted, and 21% said it should be discouraged. All things being equal, people who say they use common sense to determine what's right and wrong are noticeably more accepting. And I would argue that common sense seems to be moving us in a kinder and more caring direction here. However, while common sense can lead us to good outcomes, it can just as easily lead us to bad ones. Common sense is oftentimes used as a cudgel to tell other people that they are obviously wrong, without you having to provide any reason as to why that's the case. Common sense relies on the fact that it makes sense, without needing evidence to back itself up. And finally, common sense allows you to feel that whatever you think is true and self-evident actually is. So here's what I suggest. Common sense is best used as a quick tool, and one that should be treated skeptically. Utilize common sense because it very often is useful in very basic contexts. But question the conclusions that you reach, and consider why what you think is common sense should be believed. If the main reason you have to defend your position is that it's common sense, then seriously reconsider why you hold that position. In short, don't believe it because it's common sense. Instead, believe it because there are good, concrete reasons to believe it. Voltaire once said, "Common sense is not so common." Well, maybe so. And maybe sometimes that's not such a bad thing. Thanks for watching. Let me know how you define common sense, and if you find it to be more useful and reliable than what I've described here. And I'll see you next time.